People seem to forget, if you change today, today will change your life. To keep up with the latest episodes, make sure you subscribe to the Self Belief Chief podcast Facebook group, download your favourite ones, and this episode is brought to you by Odd Health, the easy way to speak to a nutritionist. Take control of your health and your body with the support of registered nutritionists online through the Odd Health app. You can even take a free questionnaire so that they can understand more about your goals to help with your first consultation. If you want to know more, on the selfbeliefchief.com/podcast page, underneath the episodes, you'll be able to find more information. Lee, thank you so much for joining me and going through your details beforehand. You've got so many interesting things going on. But first and foremost, as many of us are experiencing a very strange, turbulent time at the moment, how are you finding it?
Yeah, it's been a challenging time, absolutely no doubt about it. And at the same time, David, it has been a time to really take a step back, reflect, and start to look at not only what's going to happen in the future and how we can start to try to action things to either step into that or protect ourselves against that, but ultimately to look at ways of doing things differently and to look at how we can continue to help people through turbulence, through crisis, and how we can really make a difference and an impact, especially when things are a little bit rocky.
Yeah, absolutely. And you use the word turbulence there. I really want to get your insight in terms of, because you've been through turbulence, right? And so you understand that, but actually having the kind of confidence and belief to get through that particular period and that level of resilience is something people really require right now. Would you be happy to share with us a bit of your experience in those tough moments and how you managed to get on the other side of them?
Yeah, certainly. So I'll try and keep it as succinct as possible. But in the middle of my studies at university, I had some serious mental health issues. And that was caused in many ways by a number of different elements of having a relatively stable childhood. I'm from a working class background. My parents worked hard and we always had food on the table, roof over our heads. And, I had that late millennial childhood, which was pretty comfortable. But I went out to university, enjoyed the autonomy, enjoyed the freedom. What I actually found, though, is I tried to make the adolescent to adult transition. Didn't have the self-awareness and emotional intelligence to dig deep into myself to find out how to express that. So I looked out to society. And as a young black male who was pretty technical, scientific, data-driven, and quite entrepreneurial, I looked out and didn't see anyone who really reflected me. What I saw was sports stars, musicians, film actors. So I didn't really have anyone to model off in that respect. And then I looked back to my past and realised that I'm very, very different to my own father and the males in my family, and never had more than surface level conversation with any of them in my life. So I didn't have that, that stage from there. So what I actually found is not being able to access myself, not being able to model from society, not be able to take anything from my own upbringing, left me quite stuck. And I then started to isolate myself. I had some struggles with my academics, and then it literally ended up with me then avoiding. So I started to avoid contact, connection, my studies, and felt like I was failing. I went on a bit of a spiral downwards to the point where I isolated myself in my university flat for 2 weeks and was taken home by my parents. So that was the first time I really hit that adversity, and I simply didn't have the tools, the techniques, or the insight to fight it, to approach it, to move into it. So I just literally put my head in the sand. And I went home and had the space to reflect, and then it was able to kind of transmute that and see that it wasn't me who was failing, it was the process. And not having that understanding, I could build that. I had the ability to refine those areas of myself. So I then took that forward. I managed to go back to university and graduate by building myself back up, building more of that self-awareness and emotional intelligence that allowed me to express myself authentically, start to actually chisel my own character and find out who I was. And I graduated in 2007 in international business psychology and had to think, what would I want to do? I need to actually pick now because I'm about to go out into the world of work. And I decided to go into financial advisory because it knitted together two of the things that I'd identified were really, resonated with me: helping people and working with data, statistics and figures. So that was really great. Got myself on a national bank graduate scheme, happy, really progressing. And then naturally, 2007, not a good time to graduate. 6 months later, I lost my funding for my training, and then I lost my job. So second bump in the road. And yet again, I walked away from that thinking, it's not fair. It seems very harsh. But I very quickly then flipped that focus down to realize I need to take ownership over this. There's not any finance jobs out there. So I'm going to need to forge my own path. And that comes from me. In fact, I'm probably going to set up my own business because I can't be made redundant from that. And I can't fire myself unless I need to. And also my professional qualifications. I'm going to go out and pay and invest in myself because it can't be defunded. And I can choose. I'll have skin in the game. I'll be more consistent. So I then did that for 5 years, building a business, working in different industries and doing a number of qualifications. Everything was settled and you start to get a little bit comfortable and a little bit complacent about things. My son came along, I met my wife and got married. And as things felt like they were expanding in that focus, I was becoming more comfortable and not pushing that boundary more like I should have been and trying to make life more certain and stable, which is great when you've got a family. It's not great for your own personal growth. And then in so many ways, a lightning bolt from above decided to jolt me out of my increasingly comfortable pattern and shift my worldview completely. When in 2014, I just turned 29, was there thinking, what do I want to do before I'm 30? You know, and my wife was 6 months pregnant at this point, so I was about to become the father of two, a 30-year-old man. On paper, more sensible and less disruptive. And yet all of a sudden, over the course of a week, I lost the ability to walk for illness. So my immune system attacked my joints, the connective tissues, locking both my knees in place, my shoulder and my wrist, and putting me in hospital, unable to do the basic things myself. So I couldn't go to the toilet, I couldn't shower myself, I couldn't eat properly on my own. And then all of a sudden, I had a team of people around me who actually cared, who actually helped me to do these things. And initially, I was in shock. That kind of alchemized to despair and frustration because I didn't know what was going to happen. And suddenly, it all gone. It had been taken away. And then it kind of moved to grief for my physicality, my athletic ability, my ultimately mobility. And I didn't know what was going to happen. But I very quickly again realized that those negative emotions, I had to let them come and healthily express them. If you suppress them, then they were going to come and bite me at some point in the future. And I knew as human beings, we have blazing joy all the way across the spectrum to deepest despair for a reason. They're there to be expressed as part of the human experience. And my knowledge over time and starting to accept that adversity does come allowed me to almost say to myself, well, this has not happened to me. It's happened for me. And now, how can I start to move into this? Because if I take ownership of my health outcomes, this chronic disease that I've got it for life. It's happened. I've suddenly lost the ability to walk, and yet the ability to move forward, I'm not going to put any limits and boundaries on my recovery. I started to become increasingly grateful, realizing I've never been grateful for walking until I lost it. As humans are incredibly complacent and don't really think about what you have until all of a sudden you either don't have it or have access to it. So that really fueled me on. I made a decision quite early on that I could either continue to resist the pain and suffer longer, or I could just accept that it was going to be challenging, but it was a challenge that I could step into. And at that point, I really got there. I was in walking rehab and I accepted it. I'm going to attack this disease as much as it's attacking me. I'm going to step into the gap that's been opened up between what's happened and what's going to happen in the future. And I'm going to drive that. I'm going to push that on. So I suddenly became accountable for my own recovery. I wasn't going to sit there in the wheelchair and hope the medicine was going to work. And by doing that, recovery was difficult. It took me 11 months to get back walking a mile unaided. And yet in that period, my daughter was born, and I looked at her there with absolutely no boundaries and limits upon her, none of society's dirt. She was just her, authentically expressed, most of the time crying. And yet I knew that all of a sudden, in a few months' time, she'd be walking and I was going to be walking with her. All of a sudden, that power of why, that connection to I'm going to be walking with my daughter and running around the garden with my children, it got me through those mornings where I was stiff, I was in agony, I didn't want to. I decided that my identity was going to drive my actions instead of how I felt, because I knew that if my actions were driven through how I felt, then I wasn't going to be consistent in my recovery, because you don't feel like doing your stretches and all your rehab exercises and your physio when it hurts, when you're so stiff and when you're so fatigued and tired. And by doing that and connecting all those dots together, I stepped into that gap. And even when I had a significant setback after 6 months, when some of my lower lumbar vertebrae started to compact together, I still saw the progress I made because I've been tracking that progress every single day. And I look back on when I had a bad week and look back the month previous and saw that I'd actually made progress, even though I'd regressed this particular week. And all that together allowed me to really face that adversity. And because I'd accepted it, because I realized that ultimately this was my winter, and this was probably one of the coldest winters of me stood exposed on a mountain I was possibly going to have in my life. And yet I decided this is how it's going to be. Things are going to happen. I don't have control over that, but I do have control over how I react, how I respond, and then how I move forward into the gap that's been made by anything that ever happens to you. And I had on my wall a picture of an ECG, because ultimately life is like a heartbeat. You're going to be in the trenches at times. So other times you're going to be on top of that peak on that mountain. And yet, if you stand in that trench when it's incredibly difficult and you've got your head down, you can't see the next peak that you're going to go up to. When you can't see that, or when you decide that you want life to be comfortable and be a straight line, be a flat line that doesn't have variance, then you'll chase comfort. But it's not going to be comfortable for you, because a flat line would mean that you were dead. So you've got to kind of accept that adversity come and see it as a challenge, not a threat. And it's really a time for you to show not only yourself, but the people around you that you can face adversity and you can come through it, because it's not deadly. It's not going to kill me. It's just taking something away from me. And we almost have that, that mindset nowadays that a bad thing happens and it's similar to being chased by a tiger, ready to be eaten. And yet, very simply, there's very, very little that you should honestly be afraid of in the world we live in today.
I mean, thank you for sharing that. And you have experienced a lot of turbulence and got a really good attitude towards it. And you gave that example right at the end in terms of it's not like you're being chased by a tiger, but of course our brain was built 2 million years ago. Yeah. No doubt why I use that particular example of it's not like being chased by a tiger. But our brain has to find that new thing, doesn't it? To people like me, do we have enough followers on social media? Am I good at my job? That's the new thing. That's the new survival focus, really. When people get stuck, and you mentioned about being stuck at one point, all of my clients, I always say to them, whenever you get stuck, it's the combination of just two things. It's life doesn't match the plan of how you think it should be. And the second part is you don't feel like you've got the control to change it. When you have those parts at exactly the same time, you get stuck. It's very difficult. And no doubt I could see on a number of cases where that was the sticking point, but then obviously the solution was, well, either I can leverage some control here. Actually, maybe I have to create a new plan. And you talked about acceptance a few times, which I think is interesting, because sometimes we kind of, pardon my French, bullshit ourselves about where we are in the hope that we don't have to kind of go, actually, maybe I'm not here. Maybe I'm actually a bit lower down. But actually appreciating and accepting that might be the case is the only way to recognize, okay, if I'm actually here and I'm certain I am here, now I can work out what the next level is and how to get to it. When we're not really trusting of where we are, we can't really understand what it takes to get to the next step. The thing I wanted to ask you, something you said amongst that, is finding certainty. And I think most, especially in the current climate, but especially with lots of people I work with, desperate for more certainty. Right? Desperate to know what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, why it's going to happen, all of this stuff. So you were looking for certainty. So during that story, during that part of your journey, I mean, how did you find more certainty?
Yeah, what was interesting is I actually realized that you have to accept the uncertainty, because the future is by definition uncertain.
Yeah.
But it's about you being able to dig that bit deeper into yourself, to be able to really authentically express yourself. That's the certainty that you have, where you start to be able to control the things that you can and accept the things that you can't. And that actually brings a certain calm confidence and inner trust in yourself. And that is what actually gives you that foundation of certainty in a world that is constantly dynamic, agile, and moving. Now, the every year that goes by, the quicker the world spins. And people are still looking for the certainty of years gone by in some ways. We almost reference the job for life.
Yeah,
That wasn't
absolutely. Yeah.
and lots of constructs that we quite often are told within phrases, within stories. And when we kind of almost look back at history, that, well, this, there was always a certainty. There was a king, and there was numerous political factions, and they were always fighting.
Yeah.
And lots of things are, to be honest, certain. You don't know when they're going to come, but they are kind of certain, because human beings have a tendency to follow certain patterns over and over and over again.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which does bring certainty in a strange, convoluted way. And yet it's that as the world has become as it is, and there's this element where people want to be more comfortable, but they almost imagine that they could suddenly step massively outside the comfort zone and be incredibly spontaneous and adventurous and fun. But almost from the movies, this idea of modern bravery and courage, where you run into the burning building and make that snap decision to jump out the back of a plane, when in all truth, that actually comes from sticking your toe outside the edge of that comfort zone and gradually expanding it over time. The actual courage is the very small personal actions of something that gives you that little sense of uncertainty, that little sense of fear, because so often we have to kind of step a little bit into that fear to gradually get closer towards our potential, towards the growth, and towards actually feeling that we can propel forward and make progress. And yet, on the other side, we're constantly told that this product and these services and this life will make it more comfortable. And naturally, comfort in many ways is the antithesis of growth, because you can't really grow if you're comfortable. The more comfortable you are, the more static you are. And the more static you are, the more the world moves around you and away from you. And you actually start to feel the uncertainty, because it's spinning and moving quicker than you are. And it's this idea of, I want comfort, I want certainty, security, and stability. That actually comes from moving. But we're led to believe it comes from being very still and moving slowly.
Yeah, and I always use a phrase, I totally agree with that. And I always use a phrase, which is, if you do what is comfortable, your life will be more uncomfortable, which is sort of exactly what you're touching upon there. And of course, vice versa as well. And, it sounds when we talk about it, it sounds very straightforward in terms of, doesn't it make logical sense that the more times we step out of our comfort zone, the more we get comfortable with more and more things, and therefore we feel less uncertain? But of course, that's all logic, isn't it? There's the emotional aspect of it as well. I always get people to do two things, which is, I think sometimes I want to ask you this as a question, because you do a similar work, is I get a lot of people who tell me about management tools, emotional strategies, all of these sorts of things to do with their mindset. And they say, I do these things, but it doesn't change my life. And I always say to them, those things aren't there to change your life. They're there to break your pattern. They're there to stop you in that moment from the current train of thought, so that we can do the bit that does change our life, which is in fact taking action. And what I love about the work that you do is it's very kind of, well, you talk about it in terms of environmental psychology, but very energy based, because I always say the hardest way to change your mind is to try and change your mind. And actually there's a load of other things that are actually a lot more simple. And I quoted this, I don't know how into your basketball you are, but LeBron James.
Yeah.
And he said, imagine you had a drink that could replenish your mind, that reduces stress, that makes you want to be more adventurous and take more risks, that allows you to be at your best so other people see you at your best and it's easier to socialize with people, that makes you feel well rested, that